Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first keynote session of the symposium. This is our first full day. I just have one housekeeping announcement. This is for the conductors of the experiential groups who will be meeting for Intervision during the lunch hour. We have sent you an email just now with details of which room you're in. I'll say it now, but you may well forget. So you'll find it in your emails. So Sue's group is in the music gallery. Tammy's group is in the small salon on the first floor. And Ivanka's group is in Milan Grol in the basement. But it'll be in your emails. And you'll be meeting from 1:45 to 2:45. So I would ask everybody, please, to give space to the experiential conductors so that they can get their lunch first in the queue. Lunch will be served and they need to have theirs in order to be able to get to their meeting. So please allow them to push in, as it were. Thank you. So, it's my great pleasure to start today's keynote focusing on the complexity of paradigms and their confluence that inform our work and understanding as group analysts. That's the theme for our day. And I'm going to introduce briefly John Schlapobersky, who is well known to many of you from his book, From the Couch to the Circle, but also from his long involvement in group analysis internationally, in the early days of Egerton, as a speaker and teacher in many European countries, as well as in the US, South Africa, Australia, Israel, and China. For John, the theoretical is always in the service of the practical and the therapeutic, but he is no stranger to the political, as his more recent memoir about his imprisonment in South Africa as a young man because of his anti-apartheid activities attest. So, welcome to everyone online and in the room. I will hand over to John to give us his lecture. He's going to remain seated.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I hope you can hear us well enough. Can we ask now for the lights to go down and the next piece to take place? Let's have the lights on. So, this keynote opens with the voice of Paul McCartney giving flight to the bird with a broken wing. This is the work we all do. He expresses a new generation's aspirations for change, a generation that I'm proud to be a part of. 60 years ago and more, we thought we could change the world. The voices of the Beatles and others like them took us part of the way. Bob Dylan marked the times they are changing. Martin Luther King spoke to us from a dream, telling us that though the arc of the moral world is long It bends towards justice. Group analytic training began during World War II, and then in its London context in the 1960s. The optimism of the time, a brief window it transpired, entered our field and led many to think groups might carry the day. The optimism is sustained by the heartening growth of training institutes for group therapy in many parts of the world. The work of this society has spread. Our attendance at this symposium is inspiring. Egerton now has some 40 training institutes from Eastern and Western Europe and beyond. Germany has 17 training centers with new developments beyond Europe's boundaries, including China, India, Indonesia, Israel, Japan, Rwanda, Russia, Singapore, and South Africa. And it's a great honor and pleasure to see so many of you here from all these many countries. It's a special honor and a daunting challenge to bring you my own perspective on our work with groups, and to be doing so in a part of the world that has suffered from so much violence. I trust you'll appreciate my sensitivity to matters of violence when you learn that my unusual name, Schlapobersky, is unusual only because almost all our large family who carry this name perished in the Lithuanian Holocaust in 1941. There were some 40 civilian murders in my own family alone. The killing fields lie all around us. Some are as far away as Lithuania, and others lie just a few hundred kilometers from here. New fields of death are being sown with the invasion of Ukraine. We are all neighbors to the dead. If we are to remain hopeful, we must face the challenge of not falling into their silence, and we honor them in how we attend to the living, how we protect our endangered planet, now on fire, and how we safeguard the future. Group analysis was imbued by its founders who emerged from the ravages of World War II with humanitarian principles that informed this symposium's program. I wish to honor the organizers who've brought us to Belgrade. Much reparative work has been going on here for quite some time. We're here to learn from you, from one another, and to see how we can make our own different contributions. Since the pandemic, this is our first face-to-face meeting. My thanks to the Society for inviting me, and special thanks to Lindy Watton, the Society's Scientific Secretary, who has carried this work from Lisbon to Barcelona and now to Belgrade. I also extend my sincere thanks to Tia Despotovic and the local organizing committee, including Bojana Mikrovica, who has been looking after all of us from behind the counter. To Tia Despotovic for organizing the whole show. And of course to Carla Penna, today's respondent, thank you for your response and for so much that goes beyond it. This presentation offers 3 principles for therapeutic practice. I may well have packed too much into the program, but if all you take from it are these 3 principles, I should be very pleased indeed. The first is in the responsibility we carry to foster a climate that allows each of a group's members to find their own voice. Some find it hard to express or even discover a personal or authentic voice of their own, and the group becomes an arena for this shared struggle. The second involves the bearing of witness to the voices of others. The conductor may need to speak as a witness in the group and set the groundwork for people to bear witness to one another's voices. Some group members discover the opposite in their inability, resistance, or reluctance to honor this principle. Instead, they look away from, disavow, or demean the person or the story of one or some of the others. And this then becomes the location of disturbance, as Fuchs would have put it. The third principle is in the dynamics of collective engagement that create a new engagement, a new emergent, the group as a whole. It can allow its members to come out of the shadows together and find themselves anew. Like the other two principles, this can also emerge in a mix of light and shade. Here too, it can fall to the conductor to foster curiosity about the analytic enterprise, especially when the going gets tough. The conductor leads in the spirit of inquiry from relational through reflective to reparative experience in the group. The group as a whole is only entirely in the light at rare moments of transcendence or transformation when it comes to its home key. Its process is lived out in the passing of light and shadow. Free-floating discussion can be charged with dissonance and conflict. The group can be fraught with tension and frustration at one point, or in one subgroup, and eased to the point of resolution in another. And these fluctuations between states of dissonance and harmony can sometimes be profound and often take us by surprise. Could we have the first PowerPoint, please? Good. So, what you can see is a bare screen with the group's core out of focus. And it's out of focus deliberately. The intermediate territory doesn't exist. Let's have the next part of the slide. Now, you can see that the first principle comes into effect as we start talking to each other. Let's have the second. Now we have a conversation. Let's have the third. Now we've got the intermediate territory framed by these three core principles. It only comes clearly into focus in the next stage and the next. There we are. So bear this yellow piece of writing in mind. This is the core of what we're about. We build it up in stages. It doesn't happen all at once. And we'll come back to this in the last of the PowerPoints towards the end of the presentation. Let's move back to the text now, if we can, please. These three principles are framed in the ordinary language of daily experience and in the parallel idiom of musicology, as we are, of course, talking about voices, the first and most primary of musical instruments. From the first cry at birth until the last breath at the end of someone's life, we have our voice. And these are the primary musical instruments. Lindy Watton describes how human communication rests on our innate musicality. Only by aligning ourselves alongside one another through being in time and in tune can we make sense of what Mead calls the conversation of gesture and response. The simplicity of the formulation shouldn't be mistaken for anything superficial. Our engagement is with the hurt, the injured, the lost, and the displaced, people whose lives are spent in toxic bonds. In charting our course, we bring into focus the subjects of unknown and unmourned grief, problematics that lie at the heart of intergenerational trauma that groups in particular can help to identify and resolve. Moving on to the scope of group analysis, these open general terms allow the systematic incorporation of a whole range of other terms and concepts in group analysis and beyond. You can track these as we go, together with their authors. In the cases I bring to your attention, 3 vignettes at the beginning. The core complex that lies at the heart of many people's deepest sources of disquiet arises out of intergenerational trauma, and the group's work is often akin to a mourning process that the group sets in motion for hitherto unacknowledged grief. Disturbance can move about in unpredictable ways, and our challenge is to locate and translate hidden, buried, or displaced injury into the everyday language of present human suffering, where we can sow the seeds for a resolution. In the Fuchs lecture I gave in 2015, I described group therapy as a process of making a home amongst strangers. These stranger groups sharpen our focus on how, through free-floating discussion, aliens become allies in the intermediate territory of the group. The intimate conversations that can make a group therapeutic replicate the kind of exchange that happens between people at a dinner table or round the hearth. Group therapy borrows from normative groups, but behind the seeming simplicity of ordinary conversation, attention is shifted from what's troublesome in the world, reported on in people's homes and offices, to what's troublesome about the world within the room and the person in the group. Troubled members are found internally occupied. Therapy bears fruit as each one's internal troubled group gets played out amongst the others. The group's resources, narrative, drama, and analysis, move the experience from the telling of stories to interactions of the moment, and then to reflection and reparation. In the progression from relational through reflective experience to reparation, we rely on movement in the group's language, from monologue through dialogue to discourse. The 3 principles introduced today aren't necessarily sequential in the same developmental way. They can arise simultaneously and work on synchronous terms. We now come to the next PowerPoint. Thank you. Okay. Now, forms of speech in the group are set against corresponding and different kinds of psychologies. And with the next slide, you see us move from monologue to dialogue and discourse. The work we do using free-floating discussion doesn't work in one direction only. So we're constantly moving in circular form between these 3 forms of speech. And our purpose with the engagement is to allow the movement itself to become informative. Let's go on to the next slide. Here we work to a defined direction of travel, and you can see on the screen as much text as you need to see what it is I'm trying to say about the relationship between relational, reflective, and reparative experience. Let's have the next component. Discourse and free-floating discussion, when they work through the totality of the group's experience, there's somebody. Okay. Did the person in charge hear that? Could you turn the lights on the stage down so the screen can become more visible? We'll wait for the lights to come down. Looks like we're locked in. Does anybody want to go back to the previous slides? Were you finding it hard to see them?
I think it's good time, John. We should continue.
We should continue.
Yes.
Okay. So, can you read that at the moment? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's move on. Next slide, please. So, if you stop there, a free-floating discussion develops through a series of interplays, which we all know about. It's what we're calling on all the time, and I've just come from a really fine beginning with a new small group in which these things are beginning to happen already. Next, we've got narrative and drama. People are telling their stories, and they're engaging with each other in the immediate. Next, there's encounter and reconstruction. And finally, story and exchange. All different ways of addressing the same thing. Why we're doing this? Let's go to the next component. We're looking to analyze free-floating discussion, and we can use a series of very small, limited principles. Now, for those of you who I can see taking pictures of the screen, it's great you're doing that, but please don't worry, all this material will be on the Society's website, and much of it's already in my book. But let's look at what happens now. Next, please. If you're in a group and you're the conductor and you don't know what on earth to do, ask yourself one basic and elementary question. Who's talking? Let's see the next question. Who is it they're speaking to? And the next, what's the subject? And finally, what's not being said? And the rest of this presentation is really focused on what's not being said. Let's move back to the text. Each principle is illustrated with one vignette drawn from my own practice, and then the two concluding vignettes, also drawn from my practice, emphasize those moments when the principles, working together, bring the group as a whole to life. These last two vignettes take the work beyond our European therapy rooms. One summarizes events in a human rights agency in London in the 1980s at the beginning of a group for refugees and survivors of trauma from countries in which torture is endemic. The other is a vignette from an online therapy group in China that captures a moment when the group turns into a crucible for change. And the question I'll leave with you is, what is it that allows a group to turn, to become a crucible for change? James Anthony once called this the magic circle of the group that can open its members to their own and one another's lost voices. There may be a history that is unidentified or unidentifiable, arising out of known, unknown, or unmourned grief. The lost places in people's lives may be places of loss or places that never existed. So the empty and various vacuous states that underlie predicaments of many different kinds might be defensive, but they may also arise out of unformed experience in the past. In the first case, we're dealing with trauma, and in the second, with deprivation. Some in our groups struggle with both, and we rely on the emptiness of the circle to find and locate the emptiness among or within our members. What happens next, the how, why, and what of the unfolding process, is at the core of my questioning. Subjects like troubled, empty, home, and homeless are key figurations that color the process. We owe the term figuration to Fuchs and Antony, who drew it from Norbert Elias, the distinguished sociologist. Figurations capture moments in which subjects or topics in a group gain significance through thematic content interwoven with the process dynamics of those who generate it. Home is not only a theme or subject, it colors relations amongst those who express it. As people in a group construct a picture of a home that was once safe but is now lost, they can generate a sense of safety or one of loss. They can come to inhabit the very subject of our theme, safety or grief, through a process of enactment or recreation. Some remember home as the sanctuary of childhood, whilst others, people who could not wait to get away, remember precarious attachments in homes of injury, abuse, or entrapment that left them in chronically insecure states of mind. Others remember home as a location that was both loved and resented, leaving a confusing residue of ambivalence. For some, home references are lost in an unremembered world. For others, home itself was missing, as the family lived as itinerants. Some can only find home outside the group on returning to loved ones in the evening. For others, home has yet to be found anywhere. Some find themselves at home in the group. For some, the only place of safety they've known, whilst others find it a source of anxiety, persecution, or confusion. In a group's associations, we can find an emerging theme or subject that has bearing on the dynamics of its process. In the triangle between the past, there and then, the present, here and now, and the present world outside the group, process dynamics recreate the original subject under discussion. The three principles are illustrated with collages by our colleague Eve-Marie Kimmerling, presented here with her permission. They capture the startling poetry with which the unconscious or primordial can erupt into the visual field of the present. She'll later be presenting her own collages in her own workshop here at the Symposium. They're called on now to capture the startle effect of the unexpected and improbable in the paradoxical nature of interpersonal life. The material in the vignettes has been authorized and anonymized in accordance with the ethical requirements of the Institute of Group Analysis and International Psychoanalytic Association. All who might recognize themselves have been consulted, and some have helped to shape the content. So, vignette number 1, Finding a Voice. Two members of a small group, a man and a woman who've been with us for some time, recreate detail of early parental betrayal. Can you follow this on the screen all right? Though cared for physically, they were embroiled in emotional injuries for which they had neither words nor recognition. A man in the group says to a woman, "I think you were abandoned before you knew it." And when she protests, he replies, "I look at you casting about, going from place to place and person to person. You look just so lost. I look at you," he says, "and I see myself." And tears come to her eyes. His mirror opens her heart. By finding voices for these histories, these two have gained a new degree of autonomy and well-being in the beginning of a reparative dialogue. The dialogue becomes discourse when joined by a third participant, a newcomer amongst us named Michael, who unexpectedly draws attention to himself, which he rarely does, telling us he's having a panic attack in the room. We can see it. He's agitated all over the place. He can't bear to hear what these two have to say about their own childhoods. He has no memory of his own, but is filled with alarm as he listens to theirs. His own agitation and upset fill the room. It must have been terrible, people say, because the room is just so full of his distress and he can remember nothing. Someone else comments that it's his agitation that's speaking. We know that in his early teenage years, his mother sent him to live with relatives in the UK to get him away from conflict with his alcoholic father in their Australian home in Melbourne. Now he gives us other glimpses of early hurt and injury. His body carries the panic that cannot be registered in words. We see him speak with his body's voice, and he's embarrassed by his loss of control. But people encourage him to talk to us about what he's feeling in the moment. In addition to the role of holding and containment, my own contribution is a concluding observation that day that the hurt in the room tells us about what he simply cannot remember, the feelings of a troubled little boy. Now, we come to the first of Eve-Marie Kimmeling's slides. Yeah, I'm afraid we're on the incorrect sequence. These are the Kimmeling slides, and there are 3 of them. Yeah, so please can you drop the other? Okay, that needs to be zoomed up.
Who's doing that?
Okay. Now, can you see that what Eve-Marie has given us with her wonderful collage imagination is a series of pictures giving us explorers of deep time, exhausting all possibilities. Let's go down a bit. A golden moment and sublime resonance. Now, I thought this was a much better summation of the kind of thing happening in a group than any number of details in process commentary. Can you drop the slide and go back to the text, please? No blackbirds now.
He's on the text. He's on the text.
Okay. The psychotherapist's quest is to penetrate the heart of stone that holds the secrets of inner injury. To do this, we need to find form in its silence. We sit through what Fairbairn calls the return of bad objects, the disturbing consequences arising out of hidden and now recently felt sorrow to which our groups give voice. The holding environment contains this man's disturbance, giving a context to his agitation, meaning to his hidden history, and a new sense of the possible in this encounter with his lost past. He does not have a voice made up of words. It's his body that does the speaking, and it speaks to the group of a deep-seated fear that's always been present, and the group over time helps him put it finally into words. We begin to find answers to the question he poses. Will he always be haunted by his lost childhood? We get close to his most profound fears by attending to what he does not say. The worry is not revealed by what he says, but by what he cannot say. We work between the notes, as Lindy Watton puts it, in the first of her own original publications. Human suffering, including serious early deprivation, the adult or childhood experience of grave injury, adversity, trauma, or abuse, creates its own areas of silence. These are the shadows of hidden injury where numbness, betrayal, the permanent sense of living in a state of exile from the self and others can remain deeply concealed. The earlier and the more serious the injury, the greater can be the level of encapsulation or dissociation. Our task in psychotherapy is to gain access to these hidden areas of silent affliction, allowing people to find their own voices and freeing up the voices of others. We come now to bearing witness, vignette number 2. Juliet was working out her notice after 7 years in a twice-weekly group. She had a successful career and was finally settled with a partner. She'd lived through a childhood of conflict between her parents, their painful divorce, and finally her mother's severe mental illness. She ran away at 17 when her mother became dangerously psychotic and left the country to join a father she hardly knew in Hong Kong. Living abroad, she did well at university, established herself as a business consultant, and found love with a new man. They returned to the UK and were in the process of setting up home together. But she still had to overcome many adversities, and the group gave her a context in which to gather and find it herself. The group became an auxiliary ego. She knew that her earlier failed marriages arose out of a personal history still alive inside her, which she now brought into the group. During her early years with us, we appreciated her insights but found her brittle and defensive. If we came too close to her core conflicts, we found anger, repudiation, and withdrawal. People gave her the adjective stony, describing her as hard as flint. Despite increasingly open accounts of early injury, we hardly ever saw tears. She left the group a few times, returning after some sessions or indeed on one occasion after some months away. These were the patterns of conflict associated with her current partner and previous husbands. Splitting associated with the encapsulation of early injury. People recognized that what she did with us in the group was a mirror to the pattern described with her partner. Another member, who was once a Boy Scout, described her communication as kind of semaphore, the language of flags on boats. Semaphore, made up of only two signals. She gave people only two options. One flag for love me, and the other flag for fuck off. Whoever could not give her the first got the second. The splitting that governed attraction and rejection had ruinous consequences for her previous love relationships, but here slowly the holding power of the group and its members allowed integration of different psychic pressures. Some years later, soon after the death of another woman's father, at the time when people were in tears about lost parents, she gave notice of departure. Juliet was grieving about her forthcoming departure during a period of mourning, but showed no appropriate emotions. People had seen her through a great deal and knew her intimately. She'd become an affectionate, available, and emotional woman and gained a resilience that was to see her through many crises still to come. Much of her defensive encapsulation was resolved, and so was some of the splitting. On leaving, though, she had no words or explanation in response to others' concerned inquiries, and we lived with the weight of her sorrow during long silence. Close to the leaving date, she began to weep unexpectedly, but could say nothing about her tears, and we had to just leave her to cry. Eventually, she found words to put an end to a silence she'd never known that she was living with. Without warning, she said, "You people are crying for what you've lost." It was true. 3 of them were crying for parental loss. Juliet said, "You're crying for what you've lost. I'm crying for what I never had, and this is different." We all knew only too well what she meant. This was her region of the unspeakable. She went on to say, "It makes losing you all now feel very dangerous. You're the only family I've had where love has been safe." And she looked at me in an intense way that seemed to take me in with great meaning that was sustained through her concluding sessions and remained part of our continuing relationship. Now, let's insert Kimmerling's slide number 2, Becoming Invisible. Good. If you could zoom in and go up and down.
5 or 6 minutes.
So you can see the work progressing between the elements of reparative experience. Let's move back to the text.
There'll be 5 minutes or so. Skip one of the
Okay. So, these areas of unspeakable injury belong to Juliet's early years, leaving her set apart and marked by difference. Only by denying the fear, shame, and madness of her history did she feel she could lead a normal life. Now she made a poignant observation on leaving, sharing its prime contribution. She discovered, she said, that it was never too late to have a happy childhood. The phrase remains alive in the group some 25 years on, despite its rotating membership. The unspeakable silence was about an aspect of her history for which, until she found the words, she did not realize she did not understand. No one could have given her these words until she found them for herself. It was the same in Michael's case. The encapsulated injuries required denial to create the illusion of normality, and the price paid was hardness and splitting that undid any option for living through the ambiguities of ordinary life. What Michael and Juliet each found in their different groups was that by remembering the past, penetrating the core of its injuries and the heart of stone, and then coming to terms with their radical and different histories, they could finally leave the past behind. The earlier silence of a dissociated history had ruinous consequences for what they most hoped for, a happy family life. This was replaced as they made new sets of terms with their own histories and learned to play with their own and each other's experience. Barwick describes how the witnessing process, observation and self-observation, is a crucial therapeutic activity, facilitating the revision of both ego and superego boundaries. He quotes the emphasis given by Fuchs in his model of three, the simplest elementary model for the understanding of interpersonal relationships. The narrative detail given in Vignette 2 describes the developmental impact of bearing witness, of witnessing and being witnessed at the core of the model. The process rests on what he calls witness credibility, in which the foundations of self allow individuation through the gradual patterning of difference. The witness must not only witness, but speak and bear witness. If the silent witness cannot speak, he must be encouraged to speak in the group. The therapist must. It's only the process of an ever-evolving dialogue between witnesses that transforms what might otherwise be stoic resignation. In her recent Fuchs lecture, Miriam Berger anchors the witnessing process in the horizontal axis of group life, supported by her discussant, Joanna Skoronska. Facts matter, she says, just as the obliteration of facts matters. She caught on the writing of Ashuach and Berman, who direct us to adopt a concerted look into the cyclic nature embedded in human sociality. Horizontality offers us a perspective which opens up an ever-growing awareness of the lived interactive processes which unfold amongst members of the group. Now, I'm going to skip Vignette 3, insert Kimmeling number 3 slide, Dream Weavers, Shapeshifters, and Divine Threads Transformed. We could zoom in. We're looking at object of desire, dream weavers, shapeshifters, divine threads transformed. Now, so there's a quality of crazy imagery here, the improbable, the unexpected, and the poetic, all emerging as a commentary on what's going on in our groups. Thanks, Lindy. The intermediate territory of a group is the lost past made visible. The three principles are facets of a prism that allow access to indivisible core experience at the heart of a group. Working together, they allow the return of the repressed. A man struggling to find his voice is seen and witnessed in his struggle, and with others' help, emerges from the shadows of his own long history. A woman without access to her history repeats it through dramatic enactments that work like a brass rubbing to bring into relief the complex texture of her injuries and lacunae, so that the whole of the center of her life is what she can eventually grieve for, and her tears are elicited by the group's empty space. The defensive structures of another woman, whose avoidant dissociation of anything to do with mothers is finally undone by a night at the opera during a period in therapy when she's held in compassion for the first time. In the gesture of a marionette that captures what the poet Sylvia Plath calls the O-gape of complete despair, she discovers her yearning for maternal care, and joining the group, through her tears, she turns longing into belonging. These people live with the hidden inflections of time-bound injury that carry the legacy of intergenerational trauma. The events of World War II have marked and blighted their lives 2 and 3 generations on. Michael's grandparents were respectively sole survivors of Jewish families in Hungary who perished in the Holocaust. They met in a displaced persons camp in 1945 and became part of a large contingent of survivors brought to Australia. His parents who raised him there could not give him a home. Juliet's mother, together with Juliet's grandparents, suffered a direct hit on their underground bomb shelter in London during the Blitz. Whilst many others perished, they survived in the shadows of massive psychic trauma, and like so many forms of complex PTSD, Juliet's mother could be tipped into psychotic states by any passing event. The parents of Zofia, who you'll have to read about on the website, were Polish refugees who settled in London after the war. And they also carried her stories into her upbringing. Her mother was a young nurse in the national uprising against the Nazi occupation of Warsaw and has lived in a permanent state of shock ever since. She carried an utterly blank absence of emotion into her adult life and the life of her daughter.
I think you could move on to the images.
Good. Well, I'll round this off with this concluding piece. They're a subset within the much larger group of people we see in groups troubled by what Friedman described so accurately as primary relational disorders. Galit Atlas describes their emotional inheritance in a new book of this title. The relational disorders of their parents and grandparents leave these child survivors living in the haunted homes of their forebears' histories with few outward signs of any ghosts. Resonance is the organizer of the group's elementary dynamics. Mirroring, exchange, amplification, valency, and condenser are the substrate of the group's life, and they work through free-floating discussion to configure its process and content. We see resonance turned into pictures in the paintings that illustrate this keynote, and I've called on this scenic understanding of the group as the theatre where enactments, positioning, and witnessing arising out of the more elementary dynamics give meaning to its configurations. Now, let's move on to the Barbato images. And this is a sequence of 5. These 5 images are intended to portray, we'll stay with number 1, let's go back to number 1. Okay, these 5 images from a Uruguayan artist I chanced to come across whilst on holiday in South America recently, are used to capture what Fuchs and Anthony called the 4 levels of the group. I prefer to call these domains. This is the current level, the faces, figurations, and features of the present, the named people in the groups, the people we look at when we look across the group. We look beneath this at slide number 2, but it's on its side and we need to turn it around if we can. Can we? We have to stop. Okay. All right. We're going to skip this, and it'll be there on the website. Yeah.
If you could just go through the images quickly, Stefan, so that everyone sees them briefly.
But they're
I know they're
they're mispositioned.
We can turn our heads.
Okay, so that's the world Barbato gives us of our part objects in movement. And they're exotic, complex creatures of mystery and imagination. They're evocative, erotic, grotesque, and sublime. And if you can turn your heads onto one side, what we've got here are 2 people at the foundation level. This is the current level of, let's say, the group, or the bonding of a relationship, each one talking into the ear of a different face. And from these two heads, you can see the flux of movement between the part objects and a host of people from the past. This is the world that James Anthony called the magic circle. We sit in a group, and under everyone's chair is a host of family residues, all engaged with one another. Let's move on to the last two images, the two Nitzen images.
Nitzen.
Yeah, I have to go. In these paintings by Maurice Dixon, I take this opportunity to celebrate and honor his creativity as both an artist and a group analyst, and mourn his death. The first portrays the empty city. He pictures metropolitan centers of the world laid waste by the pandemic. It works so effectively not only through its portrayal, but also by the way it captures and identifies moodscape. In the last analysis, we have the ultimate agency for change generated by the small group as the shifting moodscape of dynamic life, seen here in an image that can convey something desolate, tragic, and forbidden. It lies beyond, behind, and underneath the words that spoken language is comprised of. This is a different kind of language, but each of us is intimately familiar with it in our dreams and pre-verbal experience as infants. We can also see what the artist was living with during the period of the pandemic, when he knew how gravely ill, at risk of his life, he must have been. The last is a consoling image of beauty and transcendence that comes from an earlier time in the painter's life. Moodscapes can bring experience of ultimate regression, but they can also provide progression in which, thanks to our inborn aesthetic, time can speak to us without the numbers of a clock. This is not ticking time, it's not numerate, and at moments of archaic experience, when strangers become brothers and people separated by vast physical distances can eat sunflower seeds together. This comes from one of the vignettes you've not heard. Time can be elongated or compressed. It happens to us during what Fuchs calls the condenser, when time stands still and a group turns on the axis of its members, resolving experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to invite Carla Penna now to give her response. She's going to speak from the lectern. You will recognize Carla as a member of the GASi Management Committee, and you're probably familiar with her writing on, particularly in the area of large group. She was herself former president of the Brazilian Group Psychotherapy Association, and she continues her work in Brazil and internationally. Carla.
Could you put the lights on, please, for me and to the audience as well? Stefan, lights, please. Okay, that's right. Yes, I need light. Should I wait? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Stefano. Yes, light for us. Can different paradigms and Weltanschauunen meet in the magic circle? Good morning. I'm grateful to the Scientific Committee of the 88th Group Analytic Society International Symposium for the invitation to respond to John's lecture. It's also a pleasure to be back in Serbia, where group analysis has been flourishing through important works. The invitation to responding to Schlapobersky's lecture involves the responsibility of thinking about where divided worlds meet, and where is the turning point where divergences between cultures and identities become confluences and meeting. Based on Schlapobersky's insightful lecture, I share ideas about the power of group analytic project, starting with a critique of Samuel Huntington's post-Cold War geopolitical perspective by contrasting it with Elias and Fuchs' revolutionary epistemology. Next, I explored the scope of group analysis in promoting encounters with the other, the alien, the neighbor, and the stranger, making use of John's group analytic paradox, make a home among strangers, and his lecture's contributions. The clash of civilizations, the clash of paradigms. 30 years ago, in the summer of 1993, Foreign Affairs published Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, a controversial article where the author states that after the Cold War, world politics enter a new phase in which the fundamental source of conflict will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. Nation-states will remain the most powerful actors in world affairs, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future. It means that for Huntington, the most significant conflict will occur along the cultural and ethnic religious lines that separate different civilizations and their Weltanschauunen worldviews. In 1996, Huntington developed his ideas in a book focusing on the fact that culture and cultural identities at the broadest levels, our civilization identities, are shaping the patterns of cohesion, disintegration, and conflict in the post-Cold War. Poignantly, both the article and the book were released in parallel with the fragmentation of former Yugoslavia, located in Huntington's fault line, in the soil where today group analytic citizens are reunited after the COVID-19 catastrophe, which decimated the lives of millions of people. It's a collective trauma that, if not overlooked, will take generations to be mourned. Huntington's article was vehemently criticized by intellectuals. Among them is Edward Said, who in The Clash of Ignorance censured Huntington's notion of civilization identity, as well as his ideas about patterns of interaction among 7 or 8 major civilizations, and his views about the conflicts, the West versus the rest, especially between the West and Islam. For Said, Huntington's article provided inaccurate labels, generalizations, and cultural assertions. For instance, civilizations and identities are not shut down, sealed off entities that have been purged of the myriad currents and countercurrents that animated human history, and that over centuries have made it possible for that history not only to contain wars of religion and imperial conquest, but also to be one of exchange, cross-fertilization, and sharing. In this sense, it is impossible to think in terms of monolithic oppositions and clashes between Western and non-Western civilizations without taking into account their internal dynamics, plurality, and differences, which are certainly paradigmatically greater than their similarities. The criticism of Huntington's post-war geopolitical perspective received is connected to the danger of simplifying the complexities of social reality about world politics, which inadvertently or not are ideological, biased, and politically prejudiced against non-Western cultural, ethical, and religious societies, and can dangerously lead to a totalitarian worldview. Huntington's article is characterized by universalist pretensions, revealing how Westerns have long believed in the uniqueness of their Weltanschauunen regarding human values. 30 years after Huntington's article, the interest in his ideas is revived, as Ross Dodat wrote in the New York Times. The Huntington thesis would seem ripe for new attention in the wake of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the unified Western response, the more uncertain reactions from China and India. Although that concedes that Huntington's idea got much wrong, the divergences among the world's major powers have followed, in general ways, the civilization patterns that Huntington sketched out in 1993. The scope of group analysis, making a home among strangers. But what does this discussion have to do with my response to John's insightful presentation about the essence of group analytic theory and practice and the transformations in people's lives when they sit in a circle invited to make a home among strangers? My intention is not to analyze Huntington's ideas or detail if this article does or not hold up today. However, when Huntington states that the great divisions among humankind and the dominant source of conflict will be cultural, he touches on a very familiar topic to group analysis. In today's world, we can no longer underestimate the relevance of religion, language, history, values, costumes, ethnicity, identity, nationality, and group cultures. In sum, the impact of difference, the other, the stranger, in daily life and in the social political conflicts. In group analytic terms, we cannot deny the impact of the different habitus that consciously and social unconsciously has taken place in the struggles of various tripartite matrices for centuries. These differences that frequently end up in clashes are grounded in impossible communications at all levels and spheres between paradigmatic Weltanschauungen that separate and unite the neighbors, the strangers, and the scapegoats of the world. Therefore, threatened by power relations, affected by traumatic experience, transgenerational and intergenerational transmissions, threats to identity, and unmourned losses, people end up involved in long-term violent conflicts, engendering multi-generational cycles of perversion in which victims become perpetrators and vice versa, and the majority collude as bystanders. Moreover, as a result of the speed of technological developments, people became too close to each other and highly exposed to others. This close proximity and exposure is experienced less and less as an opportunity and possibility, and more as a heightened risk. In this sense, contemporaneity, the dialectics of entanglement and separation between people, increases the concern with the other, the neighbor, the alien, the stranger. This concern crosses Schlapobersky's work and lies at the heart of group analytic project from the beginning, as glimpsed by Fuchs when he prepared the review of Elias' civilizing process. In his review, Fuchs surprises the readers when he reveals the roots of his new epistemology, grounded in avant-garde psychoanalytic thinking and in Elias' process sociology. Fuchs says that what forms the content and object of our mental life, and for that matter of psychology, is of necessity being constantly modified by these external circumstances, highlighting not only the importance of introjection of family and societal restraints and constraints, but also how an external conflict, a real one, becomes an internal one. He continues, at the same time, the former personifications of inner fantastic anxieties are displaced from the outside world into the inner world of the person and become attached to the internalized objects and into the unconscious. The Foucauldian thinking is revolutionary because it emphasizes the role of introjection process, the nature of ego and superego formation, and points to the presence of the notion of the other in the formation of the self and in the unconscious itself as an internal foreign object, body, as an alien inside me. However, Fuchs and Elias' paradigmatic epistemology has had to follow a long trajectory since the dawn of World War II to be acknowledged in psychoanalysis and social sciences. Until today, it's difficult for intellectuals to grasp, as Fuchs suggested, the paradigmatic implications of the figurations between the phylogenetic, the psychogenetic, and the social genetic. Their multidimensionality involving the interdependencies between the interpersonal, transpersonal, and transgenerational process in group matrices is a challenging endeavor that reminds us that group analysis, similar to what Freud stated about psychoanalysis, is together with education and government an impossible profession in which one can be sure beforehand of achieving unsatisfying results. The work requires the analyst and the group analyst at least to know what is behind the door he may helps to unlock. Unlocking these doors seems to be a responsibility inherited from the founding fathers. Unlocking group analytic doors. John's lecture unlocks clinically, theoretically, symbolically, and pictorially known, unknown, unthought known, undreamt, unhoused, nonverbal, proto-habitus communications, innate musicality, silence, encapsulated, encrypted doors through the journey that group analytic groups provide for strangers, aliens, or neighbors. Inspired by his life and work, as well by the Fuchs Lecture 2023, Schlapobersky explores these complexities using 3 dynamic principles in group psychotherapy: finding a voice, bearing witness to other voices, and coming out of the shadows. With the support of the group conductor's therapeutic role, the group-specific factors, and group as a whole interactions, group members are enabled to make a home among strangers. These almost impossible tasks enables the hurt, the injured, the lost, the displaced, as well as the abandoned, the abused, the traumatized, and the alienated from their own past to come out of the shadows. In this sense, the group furnishes the arena that bears witness to the lost, the hidden, and the unrecognized, filling with words what has been communicated through the body. Therefore, by listening, hearing, witnessing, and relating with the stranger other in new meaningful ways, group members can develop a new internal relational matrix. This work allows for the working through of personal and collective wounds, breaking circles of repetition, and the enactment of violence and pain. Group participants can shift from toxic bonds to healing relationships with and through the other in the magic circle. However, this trajectory is complex, almost paradigmatic, and involves what Fuchs initially named model of 3, when he was trying to grasp the multi-body psychology figurations between the one and the many. In a comment on Fairbairn's paper, Fuchs discussed the importance of the one-person psychology, two-persons relationship, and three-people relationship as the model of three, the smallest mode of a group, as well as the vicissitudes of the multi-personal or group situation where group-specific factors and other groups belong. Previously, Rickman has discussed the different perspectives between one-body, two-body, three-body, four-body psychology, and especially the multi-body psychology, psychodynamics, pointing to epistemological, theoretical, and clinical challenges that have taken decades of research to ripen in the group analytic theory. The investigation of the language of the group and the different forms of speech and their psychology in terms of one-body psychology as a monologue, two-body psychology as a dialogue, and three-body psychology as discourse reveals the progression and regressions between monologue, dialogue, and discourse figurations that take place in the group analytic experience. For John, it's through the movement of these different forms of speech that the group analytic method comes into its own, creating an arena and a MICF field in which the dialectic between the psyche and the social world helps refashion both. These relational and semantic shifts involve what Rickman and Schlapobersky discuss in connection with the complementarity of the three dimensions of the psychological space in both individual and group theories. However, the analysis becomes more complex when we move from the Foucauldian mode model of three to the investigation of multi-body psychology, as glimpsed with uncertainty by Rickman. Moreover, the discourse speech at the heart of the group matrix, defined by John as a form of communication of thought by speech, the exchange between someone speaking, someone listening, and someone that listened to, demands the development of sophisticated human capacity connected to the establishment of an ethical responsibility with the radicality with the other, with the face of the stranger other, as Levinas told us. That group work fosters in a group composed of strangers. Unfortunately, throughout history, the absence of this capacity for dialogue in the Maurice terms and for discourse in John's terms made human beings and their civilizations clash, fear, and feel threatened by the uncanniness of the other, making relationships between human beings be defined according to the Latin proverb introduced by Plautus in his play Asinaria, and centuries later attributed to Thomas Hobbes, Weltanschauunen, and popularized as man is a wolf to a man. This is very interesting because, curiously, a variation of this proverb was displayed in the same play on line 495, which has been translated, "Man is no man, but a wolf to a stranger." The inclusion of the term stranger in the proverb, "man is a wolf to man," contextualized the idea, giving it a new meaning in the philosophical, theological, and ethical debate, and for John's group analytic paradox, making a home among strangers. But what prevents human beings from relating better with the stranger other, which is about otherness that is so threatening? Is the haunted encounter with the uncanny, the unleash, literally the unhomely, as something which is familiar and established in the mind and which has become alienated from it through the process of repression? Is it the narcissism of minor differences that plays with the clashes between the self and the other, between sameness and otherness, between too much meanness and too much winess, in incohesion, aggregation, massification, oscillations. In this direction, we ask is for us to discuss in which ways the dynamic principles of group psychotherapy brought by John and the challenges of the different forms of speech, also discussed by John, for a group of strangers in the group work, meet the ethical challenge posed by the biblical injunction, love one's neighbor as oneself. The idea of love to the neighbor seems to guide the theological assumptions of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic Weltanschauunen. This ethical injunction belongs to all civilizations without the distinctions Huntington designed for our time. However, the reality reveals that the relationship with the other, the neighbor, the alien, the stranger, keeps feeding violence, war, and pain in the world. The vicissitudes involved in an encounter with the other within ourselves, with the stranger, otherness in the group analytic group, as well in the socially unconscious process of the tripartite matrices of the world, seems to be the main challenge for the group analytic project. Our almost impossible discipline evolves and revolves around the challenges of the neighbor love commandment, even it turns out to be the commandment of ethically hate the other, as we can infer in Pat DeMatteis' work. Group analysts as tiny fireflies long for the creation of more fraternal bonds with all kinds of people through enlightenment encounters in magic circles. Where does the secret of this magic lie? On the stranger other. I devote this paper for the strangers who saved my life 5 years ago, and to all the strangers that we are going to meet in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla. We've had such rich lectures in terms of sounds, words, pictures, music, that we have 5 minutes left for questions. I think both from people online and in the room. There are 2 people with microphones in the room, so if you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand. Someone will bring you a microphone. Don't speak until you've got it in your hand, because the people online will not hear you. And for those of you online, please would you use the raise hand function so that I can see if there's someone there who wishes to ask a question. So, the floor is yours. You can, but then they can't see us.
Thank you for the online audience.
Could we have a microphone over here, please? She's just coming, I think. Could you raise your hand again so they can see where to give you the microphone? Yeah. No? I'm not sure what's happened with the microphone. I can't see the people with the microphones. Sorry about this. No. Perhaps you could, it will have to do as we did in the Fuchs lecture. Could you come up if you want to ask a question? Yes, speak very, yes, and I'll repeat it. was a question to John about the person who wanted to leave his group repeatedly.
Thank you for the question. It's very appropriate. She kept in touch with me by correspondence. And we kept a chair for her through these periods. She was a very successful professional, and she had the privilege, due to her professional life, of a kind of wealth that allowed her to make a display out of non-attending. So when she got indignant with somebody in the group about something that was said to her, she would go and stay in a famous hotel in a seaside resort in Brighton in England called the Metropole Hotel. And in the group, we captured the figuration of her defiance by calling this a Metropole moment. And these Metropole moments sometimes lasted for a session when she would go for an overnight stay, but sometimes they lasted for long periods of time. She kept in touch, she paid her fees, and she didn't come. And this defiance was part of the complexity of what we would normally call a borderline problem. But of course, there's no such thing as a simple borderline problem. In line with today's subject, we're dealing with complexity. And in this particular case, the complexity was that she had a double life. So she lived in a group by not being there, and she lived at the Metropole Hotel by not being there either. And slowly the two people came together.
So is there one more question? I think it's hard to react to all that we have been given this morning in this way. So
want to appreciate, I feel with your blackbirds singing, and I want to appreciate
do give her the microphone, please.
I just want to appreciate your blackbirds, Kimberly, amazing images, which I want to see more. And it felt like you are coming with all your inner group supporting you, and especially with Maurice art and all the people you mentioned. And it felt like you are bringing your inner group to us, and thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. That was a good summary. I think we will have to stop now.
Just one point.
So that we can try and keep a time boundary. They're very easy to slip with a group this large. I would like to thank John very sincerely and Carla for their very thoughtful presentations. Thank you for being with us, those of you who are online, and I hope that all of us can remember to find a voice, bear witness, and come out of the shadows in the rest of the symposium.
Exactly.
It's lunchtime now here. See you this afternoon.
Thank you to the online audience who stayed with us. Thank you.